Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Geological Society's virtual public lecture, Martian Organics, Linking Meteorites and Missions with Lydia Hallis. Throughout this lecture, your microphone will be muted and your video cameras will be switched off. You'll only be able to hear and see the speakers. I'm Dr. Megan O'Donnell, and I'm the Communications and Policy Officer here at the Geological Society. Today, Lydia will explore the main aim of several missions to Mars to determine whether life evolved on our small red neighbour. These missions are aiming to determine if organic compounds are present in the soils and rocks of Mars and eventually return samples to Earth for detailed study. However, Martian rocks are already present on Earth in the form of meteorites, and these rocks are known to contain organic compounds too. During this talk, Lydia will outline what we can learn from these meteorites and how they might help our investigations on the Martian surface. Dr. Lydia Hallis graduated from Imperial College in 2006 with an MSci in geology. From there, she moved to the Natural History Museum in London to study for a PhD focused on the geology of the Moon. She worked mostly with Apollo samples. In 2010, she began work as a postdoctoral NASA astrobiology research fellow at the University of Hawaii. Her current research at the University of Glasgow includes the study of the mineralogy and the chemistry of achondrite meteorites, which are those that originate from a rocky planet or a large asteroid. Now, she's particularly focused on how these planetary bodies retain volatile elements, such as hydrogen and carbon, during the hot conditions of their formation. There'll be a 15-minute question and answer session at the end of Lydia's presentation, so please do submit all your questions into the Q&A box function in Zoom. Unfortunately, we may not be able to answer every single one, but we'll do our very best. And finally, this video will be live streamed and recorded to our YouTube channel and uploaded for anybody to watch at any time on the Geological Society's channel. Without further ado, over to Lydia.
Thanks, Megan. So yes, today I'm going to be talking about Martian organics and specifically how we link the mission data that we get from Martian organic compounds to the meteorites that we have present here on Earth that we know are from Mars. So this year has been a really busy year for Martian missions. There have been 3 successful missions that have already either landed or inserted into orbit around the red planet. The first was the United Arab Emirates HOPE orbiter, which was inserted into orbit this February. Then we had the NASA Mars 2020 Perseverance rover successfully land on the surface of Mars, and the Ingenuity helicopter, which is attached to the Perseverance rover, has now had 5 successful flights around the surface of Mars. So that landed also in February this year. And then the China National Space Academy had an orbiter, a lander, and the Zhurong rover land successfully at the surface of Mars this month in May 2021. So this rover has just successfully left its landing pad and is currently exploring the surface of Mars. And that makes China only the 2nd country to successfully land anything on the surface of Mars. So that's after NASA with the USA. So this year has been very busy. It's also been very successful. And as you can see from this diagram, we have become more and more successful at orbiting, flybys, landers and rover missions as time has gone by. So early on, the Martian missions were pretty unsuccessful. We only landed something successfully on the surface of Mars the first time in 1975, and those were the 2 Viking missions. So Viking 1 and Viking 2, they were successful landers by NASA, and they explored the Martian atmospheric composition. They took some photographs, and then it wasn't until 1996 that we had another successful lander, Mars Pathfinder, with a little rover attached that was sort of toy-sized rover, didn't go very far, a few hundred meters, and explored the surface geology of Mars. In more recent years, the missions have there have been more successes than failures. So NASA has been really successful with its rovers. In 2003, it sent 2 Mars exploration rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. two at the same time because of redundancy. I think they expected at least one of them to fail. And actually, they were both successful. So they both landed on the surface of Mars at two different places and explored two potentially habitable sites. So those are sites where it's thought that there were once liquid water or evidence for liquid flowing water on the surface of Mars. And actually, the Opportunity rover only just died. So it was exploring for more than a decade on the surface of Mars. Then we have lots of successful orbiters, but the next lander, the next rover was the Mars Science Laboratory, so that's Curiosity in 2011, and that rover is still operational. It was also by far the biggest rover to ever be landed, the biggest thing ever to be landed on the Martian surface. The Mars Curiosity rover is the size of a small car. I think it weighs close to a ton. So that was a really big success. Now, the missions that aren't included on here are the ones that I've just mentioned because they are very recent from February. So that's Mars Perseverance rover, the Chinese rover, and the UAE orbiter. They're not included on this diagram. But this year has been very busy. And as you can see, there are still missions that are operational. So Mars Science Laboratory is still operational. MAVEN, we've got the InSight lander that's not it's not finished on this diagram, but that was a successful landing as well by NASA. And now there is a Chinese rover on the surface of Mars. So what are the objectives of these missions? Well, the UAE HOPE orbiter, so that's not a lander, it's just orbiting around Mars. But the aim of that mission is to look at the Martian atmosphere, so the chemistry of the Martian atmosphere and the Martian climate. The Chinese rover is the objective is to study the geology and the structure of the soil there. But the NASA Mars 2020 Perseverance rover is really focused on habitability. So it's looking for signs of ancient and current life on the Martian surface. And it's also, really importantly, collecting rocks and soil samples and caching them in a collection box for future return to Earth. So there will be a future mission that goes to Mars, collects the samples, and then another mission that brings those samples back to Earth. And that's really important because there are certain studies that we can do here on Earth in laboratories that we cannot do, the rover cannot do. So, using big instruments that may be the size of a room, that need huge power sources, that weigh lots, that you can never possibly send to Mars at the current time, but we can bring samples back from Mars and we can analyze those samples to look for signs of life. There's also a future European Space Agency mission, the ExoMars Rosalind Franklin rover, which will hopefully launch pretty soon. 2022, I think, is its new launch date. And the interesting thing about this rover is that it will drill into the subsurface. So it has a drill that has the capability to go 2 meters below the surface and collect samples to analyze from below the surface. Now, this is important for Mars because there's a lot of radiation on the Martian surface. So in terms of looking for current life or even signs of past life, what we're looking for is organic molecules. So that would be hydrocarbon chains with some kind of a functional group that contains oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus molecules, that kind of thing. The type of thing that makes up cell walls, protein, DNA on Earth that we know are the building blocks for life. Now, these molecules are really affected by radiation. They are broken down. So even the most resistant microbes that we know of on Earth that are resistant to radiation, they wouldn't be able to reproduce on the surface of Mars and survive for very long because there's so much radiation coming in from the sun. The Martian atmosphere is too thin to really protect the Martian surface from this radiation. However, if we go to 2 meters below the surface, that radiation can't penetrate through the soil. And so 2 meters below the surface, you may have life that is protected from that radiation, and you may have signs of past life that hasn't broken down as much as at the surface. So that's the aim of the ExoMars Rosalind Franklin rover, is to drill down and maybe get a sense of the complex organic molecules that aren't present at the surface. So what does life need? Well, life as we know it needs certain things to to evolve and to survive. So we need some kind of solvent, which on Earth is water. So we know we've got lots of life on Earth, and life on Earth needs this solvent water to evolve and to reproduce. There also needs to be an energy source, and on Earth that is either energy from the sun, or it can be energy from hydrothermal vents. So in places like the deep oceans where the sun energy doesn't penetrate, you can have something called chemotrophic organisms, which it just means they get their energy from the chemistry and the heat of these hydrothermal vents. So in places like the subsurface of Mars, maybe where you don't have any sunlight penetrating, maybe there could be chemotrophic microbial life underneath the surface. There needs to be building blocks for life. So life as we know it, as I said, is built around hydrocarbon chains. So that's carbons linked to other carbon atoms that then have hydrogen molecules and various other different molecules attached to them. And this makes up things like the double helix of DNA in life as we know it. Now, that's not to say that in other places in the solar system or other places in the universe, life has to be built around hydrocarbons. There are theories that life could be silica-based, because silica as an atom also forms the chain molecules. However, we know more about hydrocarbon life, and so that's the specific type of life that we're looking for on Mars. Life also needs to be able to survive, so there needs to be a stable environment. We can't have huge big asteroid impacts. There can't be huge temperature fluctuations in a habitat where life will survive. It has to be a stable environment. So in this case, things like the radiation on the surface of Mars may be preventative to the survival of Martian life, but the subsurface environment may be more stable in terms of temperature and also in terms of having less radiation. So the mission's objectives really are to figure out, does Mars have all these things for life to survive? So is Mars habitable? And if it is habitable, did life ever evolve? And is life present on the surface of Mars? For me, the interesting question is, if we find that Mars is habitable, but there is no life on Mars, then what kind of questions does that raise for life on Earth? It would really suggest that life is very, very rare, and that the Earth is an anomaly rather than life being very common in our solar system and potentially in our universe. So, whichever way this goes, whether there's life or whether there isn't life on Mars, is still an important question to answer, even if the answer is no. So whereabouts are we looking on the surface of Mars to get to find these habitable environments? This is a topographic image of the Martian globe. So it's just like a map of the Earth. We've got the southern hemispheres toward the bottom, and the northern hemisphere is up towards the top of the image. And the colors on this image show altitude. So the high mountains are colored in brown and orange and red. And then the lowlands are blue and purple. So as you can see, there's kind of a difference between the northern area and the southern area of Mars. The southern area is quite high in terms of altitude. We call it the Southern Highlands. Apart from this big Hallis basin, which is very, very deep sort of impact crater in the sort of southern right-hand side of the image there, most of the southern hemisphere is quite high. It's also very cratered. You'll see there's a lot of craters present in the Southern Highlands. If we then move to the northern hemisphere, you can see that it's much lower and it's much smoother. There are much less craters. Now, in terms of planetary science, less craters equals younger terrain because it's had less time for craters to impact and build up over time. More craters means older terrain. So we've got the older Southern Highlands and then the sort of younger lowlands of the northern hemisphere. Now you'll see that a lot of the rover and lander missions actually focus on the area between these two regions. So that sort of green-blue area where we change from Southern Highlands to northern lowlands, and that's not an accident. These areas are focused on because these are the areas where there's a lot of evidence for flowing water. So things like dried up riverbeds, old crater lakes that were potentially filled with water. They tend to occur along this region where that green altitude kind of changes to blue. Some people think that in the past, Mars actually had a northern ocean, and that this change in topography from the green to the blue demarks a coastline of that ancient ocean on Mars. Now, that's not 100% agreed on, but it definitely is an area where we see a lot of activity of rivers flowing from those southern highlands down into the northern lowlands, and actually around where the Pathfinder and the Viking 1 and the ExoMars labels are, you can see that there is evidence there of sort of river channels and large channels flowing into the northern region. So these are some images of those river channel evidence. Now, the first time that there was really conclusive evidence that there are dry riverbeds on Mars was from the Viking orbiters. So this is the mid-1970s. The imagery is not great. This is a 160 kilometer across image, and you can see it's a bit pixelated, it's black and white. There's not much detail in that image, but you can definitely make out that there is a dried up riverbed system there. All of these channels merging into this larger river channel. Now, obviously, more recently with HD cameras and color photography, we've managed to get much better resolution of the surface of Mars. And in fact, the cameras on the orbiter missions that are currently working are so good that they can actually image the tracks that are left behind by the Curiosity rover, for example, on the surface of Mars. You can see things at the meter-sized pixel. So we're really focusing in on high resolution images. And this is a really good example. This color image is a really good example of an area that I can't pronounce, Hallis. It's Latin. I think it means something like the fire god, because it's on the side of a big volcano. But this is a crater in towards the top of the image there that was once thought to be filled with a lake. And the lake overflowed and formed this nice channel system that's kind of working its way towards the bottom of the image. And you can imagine that water was flowing there, and there were islands in the center of this channel system. Now, this system is more than 600 kilometers long. It's on the flanks of a big mountain in a region known as Utopia Planitia. Now, that's the region that China just landed its rover in. So the Chinese rover is really exploring this region, the geology and the chemistry and the soil in this region, to figure out, is there any evidence of past flowing water on Mars? When did it disappear? When did Mars dry out in this region? Those kind of questions. So it'd be really exciting to see what comes from this area in the next few years. This is an image of Gale Crater, and as you probably know, this is the site for the NASA Curiosity rover. So this is where Curiosity rover landed in 2011, and this is where it is still currently exploring. And the reason for that is Gale Crater is really big. So the horizon in this image is basically showing you the crater rim. And it's thought that at one time, this whole crater was filled with a long-lived lake, so a long-standing body of water. And we know this because, as you can see in the foreground here of this image, there are these layered rocks. Now, these are thin layers of mudstone and sandstone, and they are quite a thick layers. They're all built up on top of each other. Now, these layers form by sediment coming in, by feeding in sediment into this lake from the river systems that feed the lake. And then the sediment settles out from the water column and forms these layers of sediment over time. Now, the layers of sediment, the layers of rock are so thick that we know this lake must have been present for a long amount of time, purely because this amount of sediment has to build up over long periods of time. So we've got a long-standing body of water here at the surface of Mars. So it's a very good, potentially past habitable environment. Obviously, now it's dry, but in the past, we think this was a large, long-standing body of water. A nice lake environment for microbes maybe to develop. Okay, so we talked about the surface of Mars, but there are also orbiters that are looking at the atmosphere, particularly the Trace Gas Orbiter, which is a European Space Agency mission, is currently looking at the composition of the Martian atmosphere in terms of the small amounts or the trace gases that are present. So if we compare Earth and Mars's atmosphere, Mars has got a very thin atmosphere, so the pressure at the surface on Mars is less than 1% the pressure at the surface of the Earth. And that's because Mars's atmosphere is really, really thin. It's currently made up of mostly carbon dioxide. So it's 96% carbon dioxide. There's a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of argon, and then there's a bunch of trace gases. And these include methane. So methane is present as a trace gas, and methane is what we'd call an organic molecule. It's a simple organic molecule. It's just one carbon atom and 4 hydrogen atoms. So the trace gas orbiter, the ESA trace gas orbiter, has been monitoring the abundance of methane in the atmosphere of Mars because it's an organic molecule and it's known on Earth to be produced by biological activity. So this plot just shows the abundance on the y-axis of methane in parts per billion. So as I said, it's a trace gas, parts per billion. There's a really, really small amount of it, but the trace gas orbiter is really good at detecting really small amounts of methane. So these points are showing different analyses of the trace gas orbiter over time, over a period of a year. And you can see there's spring, summer, autumn, and winter marked on the x-axis there. Now, what you can see from this curve that these points form is that in the spring, at the end of the spring, there is not very much methane present in the atmosphere. But as summer develops into autumn, so as the temperatures rise, the methane in the atmosphere becomes more abundant. And then as the temperatures get lower again towards the winter, the methane again kind of drops, the abundance drops, and it kind of disappears out of the atmosphere again. Now, this was confusing, and people are still trying to figure out why there is this sort of cyclical change of methane, but it clearly relates to the temperature at the Martian surface. There are two kind of theories about how this methane develops. Now, as I said, methane can be a product of biological activity. So when microbes respire, when cows eat grass, they produce lots of methane. Now, I'm not saying that there are any cows on Mars, but there may be microbes in the subsurface that are producing methane. And what could happen is that this methane gets stored in molecules known as clathrates, which are generally present in ices in the subsurface. And when the surface heats up and that ice melts, the methane is then released. So in the summertime, the methane that's being produced is released. So this methane could be produced by subsurface microbes. The other scenario is that it's produced by chemical reactions between subsurface rocks and subsurface liquid water, that it's then stored in the ice and is released in the same way. Now, being able to tell the difference between whether this methane is from microbes or the methane is from just a normal abiological or geological reaction that doesn't involve any biology, the trace gas orbiter cannot do that. All it can give is information whether there's methane present and how much methane is there. It can't say where the methane came from. So this is an open question right now. But hopefully when we return samples to Earth, we will be able to analyze the methane that's present in the rocks and determine whether it's methane that's produced by biological activity or whether it's methane that's just produced by a normal chemical reaction of rocks with liquid water in the subsurface. Okay, so what about more complicated organic molecules that have been found on the surface of Mars? Well, Curiosity has detected organic molecules within those nicely layered mudstones at the bottom of Gale Crater. And some of the organic molecules that it found are called thiophenes. Now, these are important because they're quite strange organic molecules. They are, as you can see in this diagram, it's a ring chain of carbon. So carbon is those black spheres. Hydrogen is the white spheres. So it's a ring chain of a hydrocarbon, but it's including in that chain, a sulfur atom replaces the carbon. So they're quite distinctive organic molecules. Now, Curiosity rover detected these in mudstone by drilling small holes, and you can see there's a sort of evidence of a hole there just underneath that molecule where Curiosity has drilled down into the subsurface only a few centimeters, extracted some sample, analyzed it, and found the organics in there. Now, on Earth, thiophenes are found in coal and in oil, so in fossil fuels, in any environment where you've got sulfur and carbon combined. So coal and oil